Let's get to some questions and reflections regarding the last three chapters. We'll start with Socrates. What does Alberto Knox tell Sophie to do with the scarf she discovers in her room? And why do you think he tells her this? Obviously, that second part is subjective, but let's see if we can find a place of evidence for the first part. So on page 57, let's see. It says almost the whole way down, just above Alberto Knox's signature, PPS, if you should come across a red silk scarf anywhere, please take care of it. Sometimes personal property gets mixed up, especially at school and places like that, and this is a philosophy school. So first, he says to take care of it. That seems pretty benign. There's not much to say about that, perhaps. But why take care of it might be an important question. So bear that one in mind for now. If you haven't already read the book, this will be a fun way to think about the mystery later. Why does she need to take care of that red scarf at the moment? Also, what does he mean sometimes personal property gets mixed up? Sure, that happens at school and stuff. But he's saying, and this is a philosophy school. What kind of personal property specifically at a philosophy school could get mixed up? Think hard about the philosophy we've talked about up to this point already, specifically Socrates and Plato, and see if there's anything in that that could help answer this question. Next, who are the sophists that preceded Socrates, and why did some philosophers refer to them with disdain? We can find that on page 62. Here we go. About 1/3 down the page. A group of itinerant teachers and philosophers from the Greek colonies flocked to Athens. They called themselves sophists. The word sophist means a wise and informed person. In Athens, the sophists made a living out of teaching the citizens for money, which hints at the critique of the second part of that question, but let's continue a little bit. The sophists had one characteristic in common with the natural philosophers. They were critical of the traditional mythology, but at the same time, they rejected what they regarded as fruitless philosophical speculation. Their opinion was that although answers to philosophical questions may exist, man cannot know the truth about the riddles of nature and of the universe. In philosophy, a view like this is called skepticism. Now, I want to touch on this for a second, but first, we talked about sophists a good bit in the in-depth view, so I won't go into any more detail there. We know what they were about. However, why were they referred to with disdain? Part of it was teaching for the sake of money. Even the way I talked about it earlier, you could tell there's a trace of kind of animosity there. There's nothing wrong, of course, with maybe receiving money for doing good philosophy, right? Which is partly how you're getting to see this course right now. However, it's different if it's nonsense, is what we could say. Now, a sophist wouldn't call their own, philosophy necessarily nonsense. But the fact that all norms were relative, that there was nothing absolute to discover in the universe or out there, perhaps, for many of these sophists anyway, not all of them, that perhaps alludes to the fact that they really didn't think philosophy, again, philosophical speculation is this kind of trivial matter and a waste of time. So what does that mean, philosophical speculation? Isn't that precisely what philosophers do best? I would say so as well. So the fact that sophists were, in a sense, almost anti-philosophical gives a lot of reason, too, why philosophers in turn would say, no, speculation is precisely the thing we need in order to make any progress in this or other fields, if you want to call it a field, a meta-field, meta-discipline. And you who are just saying whatever you want for money or teaching people to say how to say well whatever they want to argue for money is not philosophy. And then there's this term skepticism. I want to talk about that because we talked about how Plato adhered to skepticism too. Skepticism is a really broad term, and it doesn't apply to any one context. Gaarder's using it here to talk about how the sophists are skeptical about philosophy itself, but we can also talk about skepticism toward reality itself. In fact, if you are an idealist like Plato, you might be skeptical about the material foundations for philosophy. You'd be a skeptic of a certain sort. We'll keep coming back again to this term too. So if it doesn't feel clear yet what exactly that means, not in common parlance, not in common speak, but in philosophy specifically, then just hold on for now. What about Socrates made him stand out among the people of ancient Athens, especially those he questioned? Well, we've got a lot on that, but let's just start on the next page, 63, where it talks about who Socrates was. This is in the letter, right, by the philosopher as well. And almost down at the bottom of the page, it says, the very fact that he, Socrates, was so enigmatic and ambiguous made it possible for widely differing schools of thought to claim him as their own. We know for a certainty that he was extremely ugly. He was pot-bellied and had bulging eyes and a snub nose, but inside he was said to be perfectly delightful. Perhaps other than his character, or characteristic appearance, I should say, on 67, we get something a little meatier. So if you go about a third of the way down, but Socrates differed from the sophists in comparing them to one another. He differed from the sophists in one significant way. He did not consider himself to be a sophist, that is, a learned or wise person. Great name for an otherwise not so great discipline. Unlike the sophists, he did not teach for money. No, Socrates called himself a philosopher in the true sense of the word, a philosopher, meaning really means one who loves wisdom, which is also how we define philosophy. Let's go on to the next chapter here, Athens. What new way does Sophie receive a message from Alberto in this chapter? Hopefully you remember, it was kind of eye-opening, especially if you were really in there with your imagination, really crept into Sophie's mind and how she's seeing the world, and then this happens. Now you know things are not just strange, but truly significantly abnormal. This is an important chapter for this reason in the context of Sophie's story, not just the history of philosophy. So, of course, on page 72, midway down, it says, a videotape. How on earth did the philosopher know they had a VCR? And what was on the cassette? She put the cassette into the recorder, and a sprawling city appeared on the TV screen. So, of course, he talks to her by way of video cassette. So here we've got new evidence of, through the senses, you could call it empirical, of the philosopher, Alberto Knox, and the place he is in. A VCR cassette tape. This is old, by the way. If you don't know what a VCR is, that's okay. Imagine just, you've probably seen like the mini cassette tapes. They still sometimes have them. They're old things, but it's pre-DVD, is all I'm going to say. But what does the manner of the new message imply about the world they live in? Page 75 through 76. This is where the crazy stuff happens. He said no more, but remained standing there for a long time, staring into the camera. While he stood there, several tall buildings had risen from the ruins, as if by magic. All the old buildings were once again standing. Athens has risen from the ruins. What is this? Above the skyline, Sophie could still see the Acropolis, but now both that and all the buildings down on the square were brand new. They were covered with gold, painted in garish colors, etc., etc. Skipping a little bit, then Sophie recognized her philosophy teacher. He was still wearing the blue beret, but now he was dressed in a yellow tunic in the same style as everyone else. So magically, Athens appears in this videotape, and Alberto himself is wearing all of a sudden a yellow tunic instead of his normal getup. Now, today, if we saw a video like that, probably on YouTube or something, we see it all the time. In a sense, we just give it to Photoshop. You know, a lot of really decent editing and some CGI, and you can make anything like this happen. But date this a little bit, if you will. This is then the days of VCR. This is really hard to accomplish. And of course, she entertains the idea that maybe he just has a really advanced studio where he was able to produce something like this. Or maybe there's something else going on here. As far as what it implies about their world, I'm going to leave that to you because I don't want to give anything away yet. All right, next question. What was so significant about the time and place where Socrates and Plato were that may have facilitated the beginning of the true philosophical inquiry? Go back again to 75 and a little bit more to the top. He says, the philosopher, Alberto, says, Words such as politics and democracy, economy and history, biology and physics, mathematics and logic, theology and philosophy, ethics and psychology, theory and method, idea and system date back to the tiny populace whose everyday life centered around this square. He's talking, of course, about the Acropolis, the Agora specifically, of Athens. This is where Socrates spent so much of his time talking to the people he met. He might have buttonholed a slave bearing a jar of olive oil and asked the unfortunate man a question on philosophy, for Socrates held that a slave had the same common sense as a man of rank. Perhaps he stood in an animated wrangle with one of the citizens or held a subdued conversation with his young pupil Plato. It is extraordinary to think about. If you go back to 74 as well, basically 74 through 76 and on, he's just talking about all these instances, all of these important buildings, but also these important activities that were held in those buildings. And among them are the things that we talked about in the in-depth lecture on democracy and the many other things that were now finally coming about by way of Athens' new take on politics. So this is, a hub of artists, of philosophers, of government that is starting to give more priority to people's voices, not just the aristocratic voices and so forth. So there's just a nice hotbed of creativity and creative thought that is going through everyone here, and hence Socrates and Plato already having the way paved in part by the discipline of the earlier pre-Socratics, the natural philosophers as they are called. They have a terrific setting for their thought to take place. All right, and now let's talk about Plato for a second. What 4 tasks does Plato pose to Sophie to figure out, and how far does she get without Alberto's help? We can find this on, it first actually mentions it in the Athens chapter on page 77, but we can skip that because she regurgitates them later on. Okay, so at the bottom of 78, she recalled that the video Plato, the Plato in the video, had given her some questions to answer. The first was something about how a baker could bake 50 identical cookies. All right, we'll stick with that for now. Jump a little farther down, 79. Then the video Plato had looked into the camera and asked why all horses were the same. If we jump over then to page 80, the third question, about near the top, then Plato had asked her a really difficult question: does man have an immortal soul? Then we'll go down about halfway on the same page, and it says the thought of the young girl led Sophie to the last question: are women and men equally sensible? So regarding her reaction to these questions, to the first question, she had to think really carefully about it, but she starts to feel rather proud of herself and even considers the question answered, as it were, when she comes across the idea of the mold for the cookies, the cookie cutter. In the second, though, it starts to get a little bit more tricky, right? She wants to answer no, that not all horses are the same, and yet she relates the questions to one another, assuming that Plato wants her to go somewhere with them. She even gets kind of incredulous about what Plato might be getting at here. Was she really supposed to think that all horses are alike? At the bottom of 79, but surely Plato couldn't believe that what made all horses alike was that they were made with the same mold, which is, of course, more or less exactly what Plato is wanting her to think about. Her reaction to the third question, she feels unqualified for this. Perhaps she, like many of us, would think that this is a purely religious question. You have to either go to a divinity school or you have to be qualified somehow to think about even this question, let alone answer it. And then the fourth, she feels like this is conditional. It says right after the part we read earlier that it depended on what Plato meant by sensible. Something the philosopher had said about Socrates came into her mind. Socrates had pointed out that everyone could understand philosophical truths if they just used their common sense. He had also said that a slave had the same common sense as a nobleman. Sophie was sure that he would also have said that women have the same common sense as men. So she comes to a place of certainty again with the last question, or at least fair enough certainty based on reason, based on having reasoned her way there through Plato's questions and what she remembers the philosopher writing, that is Alberto writing about Socrates. Last question. How is Plato's metaphysical world of ideas, or forms, similar to the question of substance the pre-Socratics, or natural philosophers, were concerned with? More importantly, how is it different? Let's talk about the similar part first. Page 83 is where I would go for this one, where it says, the world of ideas. Both Empedocles and Democritus had drawn attention to the fact that although in the natural world everything flows, that is, things are constantly changing, indeed, somewhat like what Heraclitus meant by it, and yet it changes while the essential elements are all recombining and combining over and over again. There must nevertheless be something that never changes, the four roots, or the atoms. The four roots, of course, speaks to Empedocles, and the atoms, or atomic theory, to Democritus. Plato agreed with the proposition as such, but in quite a different way. So what he shares in common, of course, is that there is this sense of flow among everything. I also have argued that in his own way, he's making a case for an arche that is based on these forms or ideas rather than on material substances like water or the like. Not that others hadn't thought of that as well. And Anaximander, who again we sort of brushed aside for only the reason of brevity, just to keep it brief, he also probably would have been on that same track. But again, we're not getting into him. We're going to get into Plato here again. So Plato believed that everything tangible in nature flows, so there are no substances that do not dissolve. This is different. So substances versus forms is something really important, especially again when we get into Aristotle. He's going to want substances back again. And Plato is saying, no, it is not the substances that comprise the essence of reality, but the forms themselves. Absolutely everything that belongs to the material world is made of a material that time can erode, but everything is made after a timeless mold or form that is eternal and immutable. So at once, like Parmenides, he's arguing against change, but he's not saying because there is no such thing as change so much as that the thing that is the realest of the real doesn't change, is eternal, is immortal. Meanwhile, the stuff that we perceive and come into contact with and everything else, it's not so much just an illusion, but an imperfection almost of those quintessential ideas, forms that mold them. He also says on page 84, that which is eternal and immutable to Plato is therefore not a physical basic substance, as it was for Empedocles and Democritus. Plato's conception was of eternal and immutable patterns, spiritual and abstract in their nature, that all things are fashioned after. Let me put it like this. The pre-Socratics had given a reasonably good explanation of natural change without having to presuppose that anything actually changed. In the midst of nature's cycles, there were some eternal and immutable smallest elements that did not dissolve, they thought. But they had no reasonable explanation for how these smallest elements that were once building blocks in a horse could suddenly whirl together 400 or 500 years later and fashion themselves into a completely new horse. So here we have in Plato something that wasn't there before, not just the what, but the how. Now I do think that Democritus and others had made attempts to try and describe the how, but Plato really nailed it, and it's the crux of his metaphysics, as it were, the most important part. Last bit that I'll share here from Gaarder. Like most philosophers, he dropped in from outer space. He was astonished at the way all natural phenomena could be so alike, and he concluded that it had to be because there are a limited number of forms behind everything we see around us. Underline that word limited. That's important. Plato called these forms ideas. Behind every horse, pig, or human being, there is the idea horse, idea pig, and the idea human being. Go for a little bit farther down, it says Plato came to the conclusion that there must be a reality behind the material world. He called this reality the world of ideas, and it contained the eternal and immutable patterns behind the various phenomena we come across in nature. And this remarkable view is known as Plato's theory of ideas. Now remember, whether you call it theory of forms or theory of ideas, it's going to be recapitulated by Aristotle. He's going to draw it, though, in a new light. He's going to point out the obvious deficiencies to this way of thinking. We'll see more of that next time.